December 17, 1939, 04:32 hours, near the Kolar Front, eastern Finland. The snow hadn't stopped in 27 hours. A glaze of hoarfrost turned every pine branch into white glass. Under the tree line, 3 Finnish ski fighters crouched behind a ridge of ice, their breath curling into the dark like ghosts. A Soviet T-26 tank rumbled along the forest road, tracks clattering, exhaust coughing steam into the frozen air. Its headlamp cones carved through the birch trunks like interrogators. The tank commander, Lieutenant Yuri Polvi, muttered curses into his throat mic. Visibility was miserable, the cold was worse, and the map made no sense. The road was supposed to be clear. The Finns had vanished days ago. The tank's tracks hit something that snapped with a brittle crunch. It was a glass bottle, half buried in snow. Inside, frozen fuel slushed like amber glue. To the glance of a Soviet crewman, it looked pathetic. Someone had thrown a soft drink bottle into the woods and winter had ruined it. Hardly a weapon, hardly anything at all. But the Finns on the ridge froze, watching, waiting, ears tuned not to the engine, but to the snowfall, to the rhythm of the war around them. The second bottle shattered. A tiny spark kissed the leaking vapors. There was no roar, no cinematic burst of flame, just a crawling hiss of ignition, as if the snowline itself had decided to burn. Then a low, sudden whump, more heat than noise, a circle of angry fire erupting beneath the T-26's left track. The flames didn't rise upward. They hugged the ground like living tar, licking metal, starving for air, stubborn against the snow's attempts to choke them out. Inside the tank, Polvi jerked his head sideways. What was that? He waited for the expected upward blast of a Molotov cocktail. Those he knew. Urban rioters threw those. Oil factories taught lectures about them. Everyone knew a Molotov burned instantly. But this didn't. The second detonation came 3 meters ahead, where the tank rolled over another frozen bottle cache buried under thin snow crust. This one went off harder, glass fracturing, fuel vaporizing under sudden stress, white flames clinging to ice like molten frostbite. The tank lurched. Heat found the rubberized road wheels. Snow steamed. The hatch slammed open, and Polvi's gunner barked for a fire extinguisher they couldn't reach. Panic fogged the cramped interior faster than smoke. On the ridge, the Finnish fighters didn't move. They didn't cheer. They simply counted seconds. They knew what the Red Army didn't. Frozen fuel didn't behave like fuel, it behaved like a mine. Sergeant Arvo Kokinen held one more bottle against his knee, fingers numb inside wool mittens lined with reindeer hide. The label on the bottle still showed a smiling mascot from some Helsinki soft drink company. War cuts corners. War doesn't care about branding. He whispered through chapped lips. Not yet. Because this wasn't about bottles. It was about weather. Finnish doctrine in the Winter War was almost an art form of subtraction. Less fuel, fewer bullets, no tanks, barely any artillery. What they had in abundance was winter, so they weaponized it. The Soviet crews had expected ignited bombs. They got delayed fuses made of cold, pressure, and broken glass instead. Firebursts that triggered only when the tank itself crushed the bottle, scattering shards and vapors into just enough friction to spark ignition. Ground-level fire. Under the belly. Where tanks hated to be touched. Polvi's tank clanged to a halt. He slapped his headset, demanding to know if anyone outside had seen saboteurs, but the Kolar forest gave back only silence and drifting snow. The frozen bottles didn't mark their presence until it was too late. No fuse, no flame until contact, just cold patience. In the quiet, the Finns slid down from the ridge, skis silent as wolves on ice. They moved with the kind of confidence that comes only when the terrain fights on your side. Arvo lifted the bottle, felt the frozen fuel thicken inside the glass, and almost smiled. You can almost smell it, he once told a war correspondent years later. Cold gasoline, something you're not supposed to smell. It meant the weather was doing our work. The third blast was the worst. The bottle had frozen so solid that the slightest shatter mixed fuel and oxygen with ruthless efficiency. Fire crawled into the tank's undercarriage, kissing hydraulics and rubber seals. Pulver yelled for reverse, tracks squealed, snow kicked up, but the machine was already sluggish, half-blind, choking on its own heat. The Finns didn't need to fire a shot. They just needed the Soviets to keep advancing. And they would. Because Moscow's orders were clear: move forward until something stops you. Nobody said anything about bottled winter. But the true lesson, that these were not failed Molotovs, but buried fire mines, was still ahead. The Red Army would need bodies and burned steel to learn it, and they were about to. The forest shuddered at a distant rumble. More tanks were coming. By 05:09 hours, the first T-26 was hissing like a steam boiler. The snow beneath it melted into black mush. The flames didn't climb high enough to silhouette the tank for enemy gunners. They slithered along its belly like a snake made of kerosene and frost. That was the beauty of it. No spectacle, just destruction. From the treeline, Finnish Corporal Jussi Rantala checked his pocket chronometer. Timing meant everything. Not for the explosions, those handled themselves, but for retreat. You fight Soviets the way you fight a river. Touch, cut away, never linger. The second Soviet tank platoon emerged through the birch corridor, turrets swiveling, crews assuming the first T-26 had thrown a track or jammed its gearbox. A mechanical problem, nothing more. The Red Army did not believe in ghosts. They believed in gasoline and steel, and the steel always won on paper. Then came the first crunch. One of the platoon's tanks rolled onto a cluster of frozen bottles half buried beneath a spruce branch. The glass didn't break instantly, it compressed, then fractured in a dozen razor seams. That split-second delay made all the difference. Vapor, oxygen, friction, spark. A fireburst flared under the idler wheel, low and fast, as if the winter earth itself exhaled flame. Inside, the crew felt the tank buck. They leaned from their periscopes, searching for artillery impact. None, no muzzle flash, no smoke trail, just fire appearing where snow should be. Anti-tank mines, one gunner guessed, but mines don't burn, and they certainly don't smell like gasoline. Another crunch, this one more violent. Ground glittered with glass like crushed stars. Bottles that looked dead from the cold were anything but. Finnish patrols had cached them during the night, using the forest itself as a warehouse. Some were tucked into snowdrifts. Others nested beneath fallen needles or frozen leaves. The cold stabilized the mixture, the snow concealed it. The tanks provided the trigger. It was primitive chemistry, married to perfect terrain. You could almost laugh at the simplicity if the results weren't so lethal. For the Finns, there was no glory in watching a Soviet crew bail from a burning tank. No cheers, no bravado, just a kind of grim arithmetic. Ammunition saved, artillery spared, winter doing the killing. Arvo and Jussi slid behind another ridge, skis whispering over powder. The cold chewed into their faces, shredding skin into red patches, but winter didn't care about aesthetics. Winter was loyal to the home team. The Soviets finally tried to return fire, hosing the tree line with machine gun tracers. Orange beads stitched through the pines, cracking bark, filling the air with the smell of burning resin. The Finns ducked, snow spraying across their shoulders, but the tracers did nothing to stop the creeping flames under the tanks. Pulver yelled for extinguishers. They didn't work. Foam froze in its canisters, hoses snapped like dry twigs. Technology designed for factory floors in Leningrad didn't translate well to forests at 40 degrees below zero. He punched the hatch again and vaulted out, boots sinking in slush. The tank's crew scattered like shaken birds, one twisting his ankle on the icy gravel, another slipping face first into snow. Their breath smoked and vanished into the dark. The forest watched in silence. And still the battlefield made no sound but engines and burning snow. That was what unnerved the Soviets most. The Finns killed quietly, no artillery thunder, no mortar whistles, no battle cries, just a sudden rearrangement of reality. What looked useless becomes deadly, what looked empty becomes hostile, what looked cold becomes flame. A Soviet mechanic finally knelt beside the shattered bottles, Brushing aside snow until his glove touched glittering fragments, he lifted one to his visor. It smelled faintly like petrol and citrus. He blinked, confused. Civilians drank from these, and now tanks burned from them. Behind him, a platoon commander spat, Finnish stupidities. He kicked the bottle away, right into the treads of the next tank. The bottle detonated, spewing liquid flame that crawled up the man's greatcoat and sent him screaming across the road. Not stupidities. Tactics. Winter tactics. By 06:02 hours, the road was a string of crippled armor, not destroyed, not yet, but stuck, immobilized. Crews huddled outside for warmth because the tanks themselves had become ovens, and as any tanker will tell you, an immobile tank is not a tank. It's a coffin waiting for someone to close the lid. That someone was coming. Finnish ski troops gathered at the ridge crest, whispering orders, swapping pins on grenades and satchel charges. The Molotovs had done their part. Fire had softened the metal, slowed the machines, frightened the men. Now came the kill. And in the desperation of a Soviet radio operator, voice trembling, begging command for artillery support against invisible Finnish mines, came the first hint that Moscow was about to misunderstand the entire situation. For they weren't mines. Not in the traditional sense. They were bottles. Frozen bottles. And the realization would hit command far too late. The sun crawled over the treetops at 09:14 hours, dragging a pale orange smear across the sky. It didn't warm anything. It just made the war easier to see. Smoke pooled low to the ground, trapped by cold air that refused to let it rise. It clung around the immobilized Soviet column like a fog bank, thick enough to taste. You could smell metal cooking. You could smell rubber dying. And beneath it all, the strange sweetness of frozen gasoline thawing into fire. Finnish Lieutenant Torno Vuorimies raised binoculars from behind a felled pine. He counted 9 tanks frozen on the road, 9 steel beasts that Soviet doctrine insisted should be unstoppable. Yet here they were, stranded by what the Red Army believed were failed incendiary bombs. Torno lowered the glass and exhaled. 1 satchel per hull, he said, quick and clean. The squad nodded. This was the part outsiders never understood about Finnish winter warfare. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't cinematic. It was carpentry with explosives, measure, cut, attach, leave. Success meant no drama. Down below, Soviet crews scrambled for chain tools, trying to free bogged machines. A few attempted to tow the lead tank backward, but the cable stiffened and snapped, whipping into the snow with an ugly twang. Others dug tracks with entrenching shovels, fingers numb, morale cracking, boots turning into ice blocks. No one fired anymore. There was nothing to shoot at but trees, and trees don't surrender. Then something happened that no manual accounted for. A Soviet officer crouched near another shattered bottle, rolling the frozen Molotov remains in his palm. His brows knit. He turned to his superior. They argued, gestured toward the forest, pointed at the bottles, then at the tanks. The word mines kept recurring, wrong word, but close. Finally, one of the tankers did something useful. He took a piece of kindling from a fire cruise kit and touched it to a fragment of glass soaked in fuel. It flared instantly, a bright white-edged flame that crawled across the snow rather than leaping upward. The officer recoiled, staring as the fire crept like a hungry slug. It was in that moment, not in Moscow, not in the Kremlin, not in any briefing room, that the penny dropped. These weren't duds. These weren't failures. These were delayed incendiaries. Weaponized by cold. Activated by pressure. Perfect for forests. Behind the ridge, Torno's squad moved. Ski warfare is deceptive to the untrained eye. It's not fast in a cinematic sense. It's fluid. It's quiet. Men glide, not run. Rifles don't bob, they float. And when they stop, it's like the terrain was always shaped for them. The Finns fanned out. Grenadiers crept toward the tanks with satchel charges wrapped in wax paper against the cold. Riflemen covered them from the tree line, muzzles steady, eyes tracking for exposed officers. The Soviets never saw the first charge get planted. The blast flipped a T-26 turret like a discarded soup lid. It arced through the smoke and slammed into the snow with a dull metallic grunt. Soviet infantry dove for cover, rifles cracking wildly into nothing. Torno's voice cut through the chaos. Next hull. 2 more satchels, 2 more concussive thumps that rattled branches and sent snow sloughing off trees in white waterfalls. The road became an abattoir for armored doctrine. What Soviet officers had assumed would be a spearhead was dissolving into scrap, not because Finland had more guns or stronger tanks. They had neither, but because winter was a laboratory and the Finns were its chemists. But the most remarkable part wasn't the destruction, it was the economy of it. The whole action cost, by Finnish accounting, a night of labor burying bottles, 9 Molotov cocktails, half a dozen satchel charges, 0 artillery shells, and no casualties. A Soviet staff officer might spend that much killing time in a meeting. On the radio back toward divisional command, the narrative began shifting. Panic shredded brevity code. Reports contradicted themselves. Minefield. No incendiaries. No invisible demolition squads. No something with bottles. The line died in static. At 10:41 hours, General Kirill Meretskov, commander of the 7th Army, received the first written account from the Kolar sector. It accused the Finns of deploying incendiary mine traps, an invention no one in Moscow had heard of and whose existence offended every Soviet assumption about winter warfare. Meretskov frowned. Mines were expensive, mines required factories, mines required logistics. Bottles did not. And that was the problem. Because if you can turn forest snow into a minefield, then you don't need superiority. You only need weather and creativity. And Finland had both in quantities Moscow couldn't requisition. But the Red Army still believed this was an anomaly, a one-off trick in an annoying forest. They were wrong. The Finns had only begun to adapt the frozen Molotov. And soon, the Soviets would see how far winter ingenuity could go when desperation fueled it. By late December, the frozen Molotov wasn't a trick, it was a doctrine. Not written in manuals, not filed through headquarters. Doctrine that traveled the way real battlefield knowledge always does, whispered between shared cigarettes, traced in charcoal on the back of ration crates, and tested at the edge of death. Finnish quartermasters scavenged thousands of civilian glass bottles, vodka bottles, soda bottles, canning jars from farmsteads, anything that could hold gasoline, kerosene, tar additives, or whatever brew the company chemists swore would ignite under Soviet tracks. Labels stayed on, smudged and waterlogged. War didn't care for aesthetics, war cared for ignition points. The bottling stations were absurdly makeshift. In barns, in root cellars, in snow pits covered with pine boughs, young men in wool caps stirred fuel with wooden spoons like apothecaries mixing cough syrup. Some cursed the fumes. Others joked that the Soviets would one day accuse Finland of having a chemical weapons program made from kitchenware. But the system worked because Finland understood a law the Red Army didn't. Winter completes inventions. You started with gasoline, winter thickened it, you cached it, winter preserved it, a tank rolled over it, winter delayed the burn just long enough for glass and pressure to mix like a fuse. The Soviets weren't stupid, far from it, but they were industrial thinkers. If a weapon wasn't stamped from a factory or forged from steel, the commissars struggled to see it as real. Winter didn't care about ideology. At Kolar, Suomussalmi, and Raat, Soviet tank crews began adapting. They welded improvised skirts over the wheels. They ordered infantry to probe the snow ahead of tanks with bayonets. They tried shielding their underbellies with wet canvas, a trick that worked until the canvas froze stiff and shattered like iced parchment. But the adaptation game favored the home team. Finnish ski troops learned to bury bottles not just under snow, but under crushed ice, where the glass adopted the temperature of the forest floor. They mixed fuels to find the sweet spot between delayed flare and violent ground burst. They added tar to create gummy flame that clung to tank wheels. They experimented with thin metal flakes to make the air-fuel mix spark easier. Every tweak cost nothing. Every improvement hit like a factory innovation. Except the factory was the weather. By early January, Red Army commanders issued explicit warnings. Avoid narrow forest roads, avoid snow-filled depressions, avoid places where bottles may be hidden. But what was Finland but a quilt of narrow forest roads and snow-filled depressions? The Soviets learned the irony the hard way. If you tell a tank to avoid Finland, the tank becomes useless. Yet the strategic brilliance wasn't just the frozen Molotov itself. It was how it paired with everything else. Bottles slowed tanks, skis flanked them, grenades finished them. The Winter War became a choreography between temperature and tactics. In one recorded action near Suomussalmi, a Soviet tank detachment halted before a frozen ravine, unwilling to cross it after spotting shattered glass in the snow. They assumed mines. They assumed ambush. They assumed something bigger than reality. A Finnish squad watched them from the ridge, amused. The glass was nothing, the remains of a dropped crate. No fuel, no fuses, just debris, yet 9 tanks sat paralyzed for 2 hours, waiting for infantry support that never came. By sunset, they retreated without firing. Fear had become a weapon, cheap, portable, abundant. But perhaps the most telling moment of adaptation came from the Soviets themselves. Near Raat, a captured Red Army lieutenant reportedly asked his Finnish interrogators, "Where do you buy these mine bottles?" "From the Germans." The Finns laughed, not out of mockery, but disbelief that anyone could imagine Berlin shipping crate-loads of gasoline soda bottles as aid. The lieutenant insisted, "They must be German, they delay, they explode under the tank. This is controlled engineering." Controlled engineering. Not a bad description for winter. Back in Moscow, the Stavka War Council dissected reports with increasing irritation. Mines they understood, flamethrowers they understood, but thermal delay incendiary bottles belonged in neither category. There were jokes about mad Finnish chemists working in log cabins. A few suggested sabotage by white Russian exiles. No one considered the real culprit, temperature. What frustrated Soviet engineers most was that the weapon operated in the wrong direction. Factory logic assumed cold would make explosives useless. Frozen fuel was supposed to be harmless, but under pressure and glass, cold became an ally, sharpening the weapon instead of dulling it. By mid-January, Soviet tank doctrine altered again, emphasizing open ground, discouraging forest pursuit, and demanding screening infantry ahead of armor. On paper, it was sound. On snow, it was suicidal. The moment the tanks slowed for infantry, Finnish marksmen picked off officers. The moment they advanced without infantry, frozen Molotovs raked their bellies. The choice was binary, and both outcomes benefited Finland. Yet the culmination of the frozen Molotov doctrine wasn't Kolar. It came later, when the Soviets finally attempted to force armor through deep snow toward Raat Road. That day, the tanks would discover the worst adaptation of all. Not burning bottles, burning trenches. But that horror belonged to the morning of January 6th, the day the White Death gained a new chapter. January 6, 1940, pre-dawn haze thick as wet paper. On Raat Road, the forest lay silent beneath its white shroud, pretending nothing had happened here, pretending the trees weren't full of riflemen, pretending death wasn't learning to ski. A Soviet tank battalion crept forward, cautious now, infantry screening by doctrine, bayonets punching the snow every few paces like blind men tapping for curbs. The frozen Molotovs had taught them humility. Fire had taught them patience. But winter had one final lesson: fear slows tanks. And tanks that slow in Finland are already dead. The infantry probed a ditch, bayonets tugging up glass fragments and charred stopper corks. The captain waved, clear. The tanks groaned forward. Then came the sound no Soviet tanker would ever confuse again, the delicate, almost apologetic tchk of glass giving way under steel, not shattering, not bursting, just cracking like ice on a spring puddle. The battalion froze. The captain shouted for the infantry to fall back, but he was too late. The first detonation flared under the lead T-26, spraying burning slush across its hull and throwing white flame into the ditch. Except the ditch wasn't a ditch. Finnish sappers had packed it with snow-soaked pine boughs laced with oil and tar, turning it into a trench that didn't ignite until the frozen Molotovs provided the spark. The tar burned slowly, stubbornly, a thick, choking flame that crawled uphill, smothering the tank's road wheels like syrup. The second tank hit another pocket, not bottles this time, but fuel poured directly into the snow and allowed to freeze overnight. A chemical ambush set by weather instead of wire. What had begun as a bottle trick had matured into a full-spectrum tactic, winter-engineered incendiary terrain. Inside the tanks, the commander's world collapsed into a system of failures. Periscopes fogged. Hydraulics stiffened. Extinguishers froze. Fuel lines sweated frost. And the men themselves became liabilities of breath and panic. Smoke hugged the ground in a grey blanket, refusing to lift. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Infantry fled the flames, and the tanks followed blindly, stupidly, desperately, into deeper snowbanks the Finns had carved into false escape routes. From the tree line, at distances measured by ski lengths rather than meters, Finnish riflemen waited. No one fired, not yet. They watched the tanks bury themselves in the frozen landscape like desperate animals trying to escape a predator they couldn't see. At 08:31 hours, Lieutenant Torno Vuorimies lifted a gloved hand, a simple, unceremonious gesture. Finnish grenadiers moved. Satchel charges kissed the flanks. Pins arced through the smoke. The forest thundered. Turrets flipped, treads sheared, engines died. It wasn't a battle, it was dismantling. And the Soviets understood, finally, painfully, that Finland had built a minefield without mines, a flamethrower without tanks, a defensive line without concrete. Winter itself had become the arsenal. But the final revelation came only after the shooting stopped. When Red Army recovery crews returned weeks later to salvage what they could, they expected mines, they expected charges, they expected proper engineering. Instead they found soda bottles, beer bottles, jam jars, farm tools, reindeer hide mittens, charcoal sketches of diagrams, and snow pits lined with pine boughs. Nothing industrial, nothing modern, nothing a factory could replicate. A Soviet engineer reportedly spat into the snow and muttered, "This isn't war, this is climate." But climate, like strategy, favors those who understand it. And Finland understood winter better than any general in Moscow understood doctrine. In the negotiations that ended the Winter War, the Soviets took territory and the Finns took reputation. Across Europe, whispers circulated about the bottle mines of Kolar, the fire ditches of Raat, and the absurdity of tanks burned by soft drink glass. Foreign observers framed it as ingenuity. The Finns framed it as necessity. And necessity wins wars more often than prestige does. Decades later, a Finnish veteran of Kolar was asked if the frozen Molotov was brilliance or luck. He shrugged. "We didn't invent it, the weather did, we just learned to listen." And that was the quiet magic of the Winter War. Cold turned gasoline into mines. Glass turned forests into kill zones. And tanks turned into ovens because no one told them snow could burn.